So our colleague Alexander Hirsch wasn't able to come this evening, so it's just Shanda and myself. And we're here both with the Department of Political Science at UAF. And how we decided to split this up is I'll give you an overview of the national election results. You know the results, but they're right here. So that's the punchline. You can go if this is what you were waiting for. But I'll give you an overview of what some of the exit polls are showing us. In other words, talking about why it was that the Democrat president won, the incumbent won, and Romney didn't. And then I'll mention briefly the House and the Senate races, and give a little bit of an idea of the trends in that area. And that's basically what I'm going to do, is give an overview, talk about how we have some shifts happening among the states, talk a little bit about party politics, and then Dr. Meek will talk about some of the aspects of spending and national policy. So we're not going to get into the weeds of the local election, but you're welcome to ask us questions. And I think we thought of trying to keep this quite short and then letting it be more of a discussion. So if you have a quick question you would like to ask, that's great, but maybe we can hold the questions until at least the end of each segment and then get more of a discussion going. So this is the result, right? We have Obama taking 332 electoral votes, Romney 206. So one of the things we do want to remember, right, is this federal election turns on states, right? This is why this map is always so important at the end of election season, because it's not the popular vote that elects the president. The popular vote in this case was not like 2000, there was no split. So President Obama did take the majority of the popular vote as well, but we decide our presidential elections through the Electoral College on a state-by-state basis. So of all these states, right, the Electoral College goes by population. So Alaska has only 3 electoral votes compared to California, Texas, other places, New York because of Manhattan, right, which have dozens of votes, electoral votes. So the results in the Senate for us were 54 Democrats and 45 Republicans. This is a gain in seats for Democrats, so the Senate actually went more Democrat than it had been prior. This independent is someone who caucuses, in other words, he votes Democrat. So the Democrats actually have an advantage of 55 to 45 votes in the Senate now, which is an increase of 3. And in the House, of course, the Republicans still retain control of the House, but they lost a few seats. So the Democrats actually gained a little bit in the House as well, but this won't affect any of the majorities. In other words, in the House, all of the process of creating laws goes through the committees and the subcommittees, and those will, of course, still be dominated by Republicans because they have the majority. So in this sense, we spent about $6 billion. That's the total amount of the election, and nothing changed. Now, before you get too upset about that, you have to realize $6 billion is a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. It's only about enough to buy you 1 aircraft carrier in the United States. $6 billion is about a quarter of what McDonald's spends on advertising in a single year. So $6 billion might seem a lot to us, but it's actually a very small amount of money if you look at sort of corporate and military spending in the United States. So yes, nothing's changed except Democrats made a few inroads. This is the map again, so I won't go through it. I have some other maps that I wanted to show you, but it gives you a sense when we think about how the country is divided in this discussion of red states and blue states. This is what we usually see, right? And we think red states, blue states. But I want to take you down to another map to give you an indication that, right, obviously states aren't lockstep in this fashion. So if we go from that map to this map, this is a map that breaks down the vote by county. You'll notice, of course, because we don't matter very much. We're like counties. Exactly. Right. They do actually have the sort of a borough structure. You might not be able to see it from the back, but they haven't broken down our vote by borough. And we all, though, have a general sense, right? This corridor around Anchorage would be a blue dot, right? And then with red enlarge the rest of the state, and then Fairbanks, being a larger population size, would be sort of another red dot. Hawaii here, right, all blue. So this just gives you a little better picture that when we think about electoral politics, it really is much more complicated than red state, blue state, right? We can see here Texas is a red state, but clearly has right, major blue areas. Again here, along this corridor, this would be Atlanta, right? You can kind of think of a lot of the major population centers. Here, Vermont is really one of the only states you could say is actually a truly blue state. Not a single county in Vermont voted Republican. All the rest, of course, are mixed. Here we have a truly red state, right? Utah, not surprisingly. But even in most of these other locations, right, you have some mixing. So the United States isn't a red state, blue state nation. We're a nation that, because of the way the Electoral College forces states to vote for one candidate or another, is expressed that way. But in fact, we're far more diverse. This map is one that Democrat and Republican strategists are already looking at for 2016. What these little arrows are, if you can't see in the back, they're little arrows. And the red arrows indicate that the trend in the vote was Republican. In other words, since 2008, right, all of this red is an indication that more votes in these areas were heading Republican than Democrat. Now, one of the things, though, that actually really matters to these strategists, and this is going to be very disturbing for the Republican Party, is all these blue arrows. The South, so this whole corridor, what we would have thought of as the South of apartheid early in the United States, the old South, the deep South, this has trended Republican. White males in the South have voted Republican since the 1980s. It's been a major shift. And this is going to be very disturbing for Republicans to sort of take a look. They're going to be asking themselves, why is there this trend now here towards the Democratic Party? So this is an interesting phenomenon. Most of the rest of it is something we're fairly familiar with. But again, this is just the snapshot of how things have trended in 2012 as opposed to in 2008. So this doesn't indicate anything long term, it just is a snapshot of what happened in the recent election. And actually Alaska is trended very slightly Democrat, and you'll see that in another one. We just are again not awarded any arrows. Notice Hawaii, interestingly enough, a blue state, is trending a little bit towards the Republican Party. So another national map. Here is an indication, here's some figures here about change in votes for Obama. So I don't know if you can see, the green would be places he received more votes, and the orange is where he received fewer votes. So interestingly, right, one would think at a snapshot that this would indicate that why would he have won the election, given the fact that he clearly has fewer votes in many of these places. But it didn't decrease enough to prevent him from winning. He still gained the popular vote. So you notice the big green dot here. Alaska trended for Obama more so than we did in 2008, though clearly he didn't take the state. We've got Miami down here, more for Obama. Narlands, right, these major population centers trending. But what this does is it shows us that he did relatively worse across the United States. This is another useful map as well. Blue for Obama, red for Romney, right? And it's showing us one of a couple of phenomena. One of them is Democrats almost always do better in major urban centers. Does anybody have a sense why? Why might it be that places like Manhattan, Miami, LA, San Francisco, why might the Detroit area, why might major urban centers run Democrat?
Ethnic and minorities, I think.
Possibly. Probably stronger is that most of the major cities are first destinations for immigrants, new immigrants. So new immigrants have been a part of the Democratic Party over the last several years. They've trended Democrat, the newest of immigrants. Another thing is often in these major urban centers, people are more dependent on social services. In other words, they're familiar with being very tightly tied to the benefits provided by government. So we don't mean social services in terms of what we would think of as welfare. We mean social services in terms of public transportation, bus lines, rail lines, things that government offers. So that's another aspect. Now in some places the actual racial composition would tip towards Obama, but that wouldn't be the overriding indicator. So it's interesting, right? Here, right, Austin area, you know, big blue. Here, this corridor here, red, very Republican. So different aspects in different places. And then our dots are missing, but as we know, Fairbanks and Anchorage would sort of split that red-blue difference. So next what I want to do is just do a brief overview of why it was that Obama won. In other words, what groups supported Obama for his win, and was that any different from 2008? Right? There's a lot of discussion in the media of different groups. In political science, when we talk about political behavior, we talk about there being certain pretty dependable characteristics of groups that support each party. We know that upper income levels tend to draw Republicans. We know that African Americans vote upwards of 80% of the time with Democrats. White evangelicals tend to vote Republican year after year after year, so on and so forth. If groups don't vote according to expectation, we call them defectors. That's the political science name. So one of the things you always think about when you're looking at a national election is which groups, right, by small margins shifted, did something unexpected, did something different. So we'll just take a quick look at these, and then if you want to go back or you want to ask more specifically, we can take a look at them again. I'm just going to be brief. So if we look here at gender, right, we see of all the votes, so here's 08, McCain, Obama, here's 2012, right, Romney. This percentage here is the percentage of the total number of people who actually voted. So our turnout in this election cycle was slightly lower than we had in 2008. So what we look at right now is we think we have a turnout of about 58% in the United States, which is actually quite high for the US. We were trending around the low 50s and 40s for quite some time, between like 68 to the late end of the 1990s. But turnout was relatively high, over at least 50% of all people eligible to vote voted. Back in 2008, it was upwards of around 62%. So it was down from the last election cycle. So out of all of those people who voted, women voted 53%, males 47%, so more women voted than men. And out of that, we see that women trended for Obama, right? Males trended towards Romney, and this was different than 2008. So again, something in the short-term forces of the election caused more men to vote for the Republican Party than the Democratic Party this time around. Age, right? We have some interesting aspects here. One of them in particular is that the over 65 crowd voted for Romney, and they voted for McCain here, but this group, this middle group, 45 to 64, right, came in slightly more Republican this time, not by much, 1 percentage point. I won't, you all are adults, I won't read all the numbers, I'll just sort of point out some interesting things, but please feel free to ask if one of the numbers seems odd or interesting to you. If we go down here and look at party, this is where we often talk a lot about defection. In other words, of all those people, right, leaving the polls who have actually voted, we had 38% of them claiming Democrat, 32% claiming to be Republican, and 29% being independent. This independent number is slightly lower than it has been in the past. So that's just something interesting. Now when people say they're independent, we have no idea really what that means, right? We don't know if they're independent libertarian or independent green. They only ask them these 3 questions. So they're just people who aren't affiliated with the 2 major parties. But these numbers are what's really interesting to us. Of all those who said they were Democrat, 92% voted with their party. Of all the Republicans, 93% voted with their party. Okay? This is a different set of numbers from earlier. And one of the things this is showing us is that over the last decade, the American political system has become more polarized. In other words, we used to talk a lot, if you remember, about Reagan Democrats, right, or Clinton Republicans, people who would split their tickets. They would identify with one party, they'd cross over into another. That's happening less and less. So in the same way that when we look at Congress, Republicans are only voting with Republicans and Democrats only voting with Democrats, and we're talking about that polarization, we're seeing that happen in the electorate as well. We're becoming more tightly tied to the partisanship that we have. So that's a very interesting thing for us to think about. Race and education, right? The major shift here was that if we look at education, and I'll come back up and talk about race because I want to give you a few statistics. If we look at education first, right, people who haven't graduated high school, right, are a shrinking portion of the electorate as more and more people gain higher educations. What we see, right, is a small shift here. College graduates voted 51% this time instead of for the Republican as opposed to 48. And postgraduates have the strongest affiliation in terms of being a larger number and voting Democrat. This no high school diploma, right, remains also firmly in the Democratic camp. So I just want to spend a minute here looking at race, because one of the aspects that's floating around in the punditry and in the media world, not in the sort of real journalism world, but all the talking heads, has been this discussion that this race turned on the demise of sort of traditional white America. And that's grossly overblown. A couple of things we want to point out is that these numbers here in terms of percentage of actual voters virtually mimics, it's almost identical to the racial composition of the United States. So if we look at the 2010 census and we compare the numbers, whites are 72.4% of the US population as a whole, right? They turn up as 72% of the voting population. Blacks, so African Americans, are about 12.6, 13% of the US population, similar for voting. Latinos are actually 16.3% of the US population. So the difference here, right, of 10% is most likely because the census doesn't ask about immigration status. So you probably have a small split because you do have Latinos who don't yet have full citizenship. They're here on green cards or residency, or they may be here illegally, right? Asians are about 3% of the population. So this, in terms of vote, is an almost picture-perfect representation of what the United States looks like. Other in here is going to count people who are Native American, Native Alaskan, Pacific Islander, or have thought of themselves as multiracial, don't claim a single racial identity. So in this number, this is the major difference, but it's not much of one, right? And that is that whites trended more for Romney than they did for McCain. But outside of that, this is fairly normal. So this discussion of the idea that there is minorities are somehow overtaking, racial minorities are overtaking whites and changing vote composition isn't the case. What is true is that Democrats have done a very good job as a party in the last decade of appealing to, in different ways, African American, Latino, and Asian voters. And this Asian population is one, both new immigrants and older Asians in the population, people who've been in the United States longer who are Asian, not necessarily older by age. The Asian population is now growing faster than any other racial group. So the last census we got in 2010 showed that they're in the targeted, they will overtake, they have actually already overtaken the speed with which the Latino population is growing in the United States. So this, when there's this discussion with Republican strategists of how they need to do a better job of appealing to Latinos, that's true, right? As well as African Americans, though Latinos are more likely to leave the leave the Democratic Party. They're more flexible. African Americans, in part because of the legacy of civil rights, are still very firmly tied to the Democratic Party. But the Asian population is also one that's fertile ground for Republicans to be able to appeal to, thinking about 2016. So this is just a slide I want to take a few extra minutes on. Next one, income, marital status, and ideology. Not a lot's changed here, right? Those who make under 50K, remember everybody in the United States likes to be middle class. We find this sociological phenomenon. People between who make under 50K up to $100,000, all when you ask them, they'll say, I'm middle class. But not everybody is really middle class in the United States. So this is the break that this uses. I'm not sure why they use 50K in their exit polls, but here we have it. So those who make under 50K trended exactly the same for the Democrats. Those in sort of this, what we think of as a middle income group, 50 to 99, right? Which again, once you're over 60K, you're starting to become in a minority in the United States, so to speak. But here we have trending for Republicans, and this has almost always trended Republican, the highest incomes over time. So nothing new there. This is another thing that the pundits have been throwing around a lot as well, this idea of why is it that non-married women so strongly support Democratic candidates. It's not anything new in this election. They did the same before. So there's different aspects to this. Some argue that marriage, because it's nowadays not as frequent, right, if we look at these statistics, represents individuals who tend to have a more conservative ideology. It's possible. We don't actually know the answer to this. It could be as well that non-married individuals simply also happen to be somewhat younger. So we know that the Democratic vote has trended among the young a little bit, but no surprises. If we look down here at ideology, now this would be separate from party. This would be how people view themselves. And so what's interesting here for us, right, is that notice when they're asked, 25% of all the people who voted felt that they were liberal, 41% felt they were moderate, and 35% felt they were conservative. But this group right here, right, is one of the tipping points that helped the Democrats win. In other words, conservatives were very clearly tied to voting Republican, but this is what we often talk about, right, is that middle ground. Middle America, most people who are not terribly liberal or terribly conservative. This is, again, another number that party strategists are going to be thinking about for some time. So the moderate and liberal vote was able to be captured by the Democrats, but that moderate vote is something, of course, that both parties would very much like to have. All right, we're nearly done. Religion, no surprises here. This remained relatively similar. In both cases, we have a trend for Romney among Protestants. Catholics do tend to trend Democrat, but we lost a little ground there for the Democrats in this election. The something else category, so this would be individuals, something else and none, right? None would, of course, refer to atheists. Something else would be anything else other than the traditional Judeo-Christian religions, I guess we would say faiths. Here, again, no surprises. One of the concerns was, would the white evangelical vote, though, turn out? Because white evangelicals have had, historically, some doctrinal debates with Mormons and, what's his name again? Billy Graham, the very famous evangelical, for quite some time listed Mormonism as a cult on his website, and recently changed that in the year leading up to the election, and then put his support behind Romney. So I have some students who are writing about the evangelical vote, a young man who's very interested in the Christian vote, and he said the initial results that he's seeing is that there is a slightly lower turnout among white evangelicals for this election than there was in the past, but not enough to have made an enormous difference. So everything here is roughly as we expected it to be. All right, nearing the end. Now these are where we get into some of the nitty-gritty. So if you want to take race and demography out of it, look at this one in particular and think about the major difference that this is from 2008. So if we can block this out of our minds for a second and just go back in time to 2008, right, where we were in such dire financial straits, right? At the end of 2007, things starts tanking, right? Goes through 2008. So in this instance here, all of those who think that, right, in 2008, we're doing worse, right? 71% are voting for the Democrats, which isn't that surprising. You're repudiating the old regime, right? You're moving against what you feel might have brought you to that situation. Those who thought that we were doing better, clearly voting Republican, about the same, clearly voting Republican. If we go now to, right, our current election, of those who think we are worse off, and it was 33% of all people think we were worse off when they voted, they are, of course, going Republican because they're pushing against right? The Democrat who was in office. So that's not very surprising. What is surprising is I think it's interesting that 66% roughly of all the people who voted don't think they're worse off. And that's something that you always watch for, and as we were watching the elections, the media always says if people don't think that they're better off, or if they think they're actually worse off, they're unlikely to support an incumbent. So that tipped in the Democrats' favor. Here, under the issues, we don't have the data from the 2008. They didn't ask these questions. So these questions are just for 2012. But this is very interesting. So people were given 4 choices. And of these 4 choices, almost 60%, so 59% said the economy was their top issue. But look at this. This is very interesting. More people felt that health care was the next most important issue than the federal budget deficit. So again, this is an interesting juxtaposition, and foreign policy, which remember was a real effort on the part of the Republicans as a strategy towards coming into the election at the end, and they really hammered on it in the debates, trying to get that foreign policy concern, it remained quite small. And so those thinking about the economy and the federal budget deficit trended Republican, though interestingly enough, only narrowly by the economy, this budget deficit. So this could also have something to do with the Ryan phenomenon as the vice presidential ticket. Foreign policy went Democrat, and health care here very strongly to the Democrats. This is probably where the Romney campaign had the most difficulty, right? When you think about looking at the top qualities required in a president, that's how the question was worded, right? 21%, so it's not the most important component of all those who elected, but this is that sort of likability issue. Again, what we see is when we look at all the elections over time, we have long-term trends, but there's nothing you can do, so to speak, to predict what kind of candidate actually is nominated and then runs. And in this instance, here's where that likability gap did hurt the Republican Party. Down here, though, notice, right, all these other characteristics trended towards the Republicans. Even shares my values, which is a little surprising simply again in terms of, right, not necessarily caring about people like me, but nonetheless a majority feeling that Romney, in this instance, shared their values. So interesting how this divided up. And the last slide is the national economy slide. So this is the very general idea. So I don't know if you can see in the back, only 23% of the population felt the economy was excellent or good, right? They trended Democrat, and not surprisingly, right, they trended Republican in 2008 because they would have then wanted to return a Republican because they felt that way after a Bush era. And here, right, those feeling the economy is not good, right, trending towards Romney. And again, we saw that same phenomenon happening in 2008. So this is just a general overview of how, or I'll go back in case anyone wants to see anything, how the electorate broke down and what the major, well actually the minor forces. In other words, this was a tight election. So just some of the shifts that we saw in terms of the percentages were enough to flip enough states blue and give Obama in this instance the election. So I don't know if anyone wants to ask questions about some of these trends.
One quick one. What is the source of the data?
Oh, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned. These are exit polls from the Washington Post. Okay. So major reputable newspaper, not a nonpartisan press.
Not the Gallup polls, for example.
No, they're not Gallup. I used the Washington Post in part because they had really good tables, but they also had their numbers out fastest. And it tends to be the national newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal, who are there doing a lot of the exit polls because they want to have the data up front to be able to report on it. So I use this as a source. I should have said that at the very beginning. I apologize. The source is the Washington Post. Yeah. And this gentleman, should I say it next? Same question. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you take it back to the very first slide
Sure.
of the poll nation?
Just the state name, the states.
Yeah. That one.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when you look at the turnout or the vote between Romney and Obama, in the red states that are there, Romney really won. The margin between Romney and Obama was, you know, typically, from what I've been able to see, 10 to 15 points at a minimum.
It's a sliding scale, and actually I think maybe the county one would help us out a little bit with that. There's a great graphic that you can see online.
Yeah.
It wouldn't fit into the poll that shows the states on the ends. It's also, is it Washington Post or New York Times that has it? It's one of the two, Washington Post or New York Times. And it shows the margin by which each candidate took each state. And actually, the biggest margin, there's big margins on both sides. In other words, places where Obama won, for example, California, he won California still by a very large margin.
Right.
So I think what you're saying isn't inaccurate. And certainly, so Utah is on the far right. That's where Romney had the largest margin. California is where Obama had the largest margin, and then the other states start moving inwards. But yeah, there are states that had, for example, where were we? North Carolina, right, in the last election went for Obama, and this time it just barely went for Romney. It was just barely for Obama and Oregon as well. So that would be that difference between places we think of as swing states versus the ones that, right, everyone just sort of gave up. I mean, that's why the candidates don't go to a lot of these states. Romney didn't go to Utah to campaign because it was wasted money. He knows he's going to have a large margin in that state. I don't know if I stepped over your question.
No, actually, that's kind of the direction I was going with. My observation is just that in many of the blue states, the states that went for Obama, the differential wasn't as, much more narrow.
In some cases, though, this can also be misleading because we have to remember that in some instances, population, exactly. So if we go to Colorado, this is really where most people live. Once you head out on these areas, it's in part because of climate and farming, right? He really did capture more of a margin than you would think simply by looking at this, because those would be where the population centers were. So that's when you get into that real nitty-gritty of thinking about, where most people are.
One other thing, since we're on this map, I actually read somewhere that we don't have any data on Alaska on these national maps because we report on legislative district as opposed to county.
Right, and
so, yeah. So they don't have the data in the same kind of GIS map boundaries that they could use.
And much later, Alaska usually gets backfilled because someone goes and breaks down the data by vote, and so in 3 years they'll fill us in.
Right.
But this is right after the election, so exactly, we don't report in a way that is easy for the Post to fit into its demography, and so we don't show up in that sense. Yeah, no, useful. Please.
I guess it's amusing that people with no high school degrees and people with doctorate degrees vote the same, and the people in the middle vote the opposite. Tells you something about people, doesn't it?
Well, your amusement, I think, is pointing out something that the idea would be that these two groups in society we would think would be quite different from one another, right? So if that's the case, then there must be something outside of their, right? Because this surely trends with income, right? That would be one thing that we could tie that to. And we would see then that there must be something about the Democratic platform that appeals both to people who have very little education and then probably very low income, as well as those who have a very high degree of education and certainly a higher degree of income. Though there's a lot of us with PhDs who are certainly not making as much money as this sector right here. So that is, right, something where the Democratic Party, for example, would be thinking a lot about that, right? What is it about these two groups that makes them both drawn towards our particular kind of party platform? And it could be two very different things, right? In one case, it could be that often those without high school diplomas need at different times in their life social services, which is something that the Democratic Party, on a regular basis seeks to uphold Social Security, unemployment benefits. And it could be that postgraduate study may appeal. Maybe there is something about having such high degrees of education that, I don't know. I don't know how to tease that one out. Maybe very high degrees of education somehow encourage you to think more collectively. I don't know. I'm not sure. That's where we'd have to go and ask all that voting group, right? Some of these questions.
But then further of that, there's a whole lot more MBAs walking around, not just masters, but MBAs walking around than there are masters or PhDs. And then the stock market's gone down over 700 points since the election.
I don't know.
I don't either.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about for sure. Sure, Joe.
Yeah, I'm just curious. It seems like this election, it was pretty much a 9-state election. So, is the trend showing that we're not necessarily a national election per se, where it's going to be more very targeted races as we move on? Because I mean, the Electoral College was a slaughter versus the closeness of the popular vote. And if you lived in Maryland per se, neither candidate was going to come to Maryland, Wyoming, Texas, wherever. But those 9 swing states is where the majority of at least for the presidential elections, all the money was, primarily the money was spent.
I mean, I think that's, again, one of those perennial questions. Do we want to get rid of the Electoral College? Right? That would force candidates out of those swing states and onto national tours. So one thing is, and it actually probably would make elections more expensive if you got rid of the Electoral College, because of the, it wouldn't happen immediately because people would be comfortable. And remember, most states actually bind their electors by law to represent the popular vote. Though technically, that, you know, at the start, that wasn't the case. Electors initially, at the founding, were meant to be independent individuals who voted according to their own beliefs. But over time, they've become bound to the states. So the battleground state phenomenon won't change unless the composition of voting in those battleground states does change. So this next map that I was showing here, this is of particular interest now to Democrats because this is unusual, right? The South has been trending very, very much towards the Republican Party. So why is this the case? Are we potentially going to see a battleground state in Mississippi, right? Which has not been a battleground state. So those are some of the things we don't know. Battleground states change over time. They're not always the same. Remember, there was a big push at the last minute, sort of in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then the Republican Party figured out that numerically they weren't going to win there, so they sort of pulled back at the end. Pennsylvania was talked about as a battleground up front, and then kind of faded. So those don't tend to usually shift by election, but they tend to shift by every couple of elections in that sense. And then I think, unless there's another burning question, we should let Dr. Meek talk about what she would like to discuss.
I'm Dr. Shanda Meek, and I'm in the Political Science Department, though I'm more of a generalist. And my area of expertise tends to be environmental policy and resource policy. So I thought I would talk about a couple of policy areas that are likely to be in the news, especially related to federal spending trends. I'll have a less structured talk than my esteemed colleague here. But again, like I wanted to lay out some broad themes, and then, you know, if we can have a bit of a discussion. All right, so the main policy areas that I see as becoming important things for Alaskans to think of include the implementation of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, balancing resource extraction and conservation. As you all know, there's been a pitched battle between the governor and federal agencies responsible for leasing and permitting. So whether or not we see those two entities start working together more constructively, I think will be something to watch. And then Arctic policy is becoming a larger area of policy that, 10 years ago really wasn't in the headlines. Whereas now, we are seeing both a military as well as an infrastructure buildup in parts of the Arctic, both for security reasons as well as resource extraction reasons. So, first of all, one big driver of federal spending in Alaska has been the stimulus program, and this was the plan that Obama passed in 2009, which really targeted delivering money into all of the states in order to promote what they were calling shovel-ready projects. Do I have to do something special to get this to come up? It's thinking. Okay, good. But this money is trending downwards. And so one thing I wanted to do in this talk is just talk about a couple of the federal websites that might be of interest to folks that want to do a little bit of their own research later on. This website was set up to track the, grants, but also loans, all areas that were related to the spending bill, as well as tax benefits for, as you know, the stimulus plan had a broad sweep of tax cuts for both small businesses as well as individuals on the payroll tax. And then entitlements. So if you look across those three areas, luckily for us, there is an Alaskan presence on this map, and we can use it to try to understand how we benefited from those funds, if we did. Some people would argue that that these funds are pork barrel projects that shouldn't be funded. And some of the groups that actually track federal spending and who have a lot to say, particularly when Senator Stevens was earmarking a lot of money for Alaska, those sites can actually be a good source of information if you just kind of screen out the bias against the projects, because they tend to dig out more information about various projects. And they always, Don Young has won their pork barrel, or I don't know what they call it, but award several years running, which is, part of his job, what he does for us. So if we look at the recovery, we can even go into, let's see if that works. One thing I noticed when I was scrolling through these, a lot of these are construction companies, and a lot of these relate to, say, the renovation of the hospital in Fort Wainwright. These large projects that relate to federal facilities that are being upgraded. There were a lot of what we might consider smaller projects, but let's see if we can go. Can't quite see where Fairbanks is, but I pointed to something there. So.
Just below that.
Oh, it is just below that? Are we here?
You're right in that borough, yeah.
Okay. Well,
That's,
The Denali borough,
yeah.
so they don't have Fairbanks borough in there.
No, we're there, it's just the same
there,
color.
it's just kind of dark. I think
Yeah.
I got it. Overall, if we scroll up here, total funds awarded is $2,376,000,000. Total awards 3,434, and jobs by quarter is 1,253 jobs. And those were jobs, I'm guessing, since it was reported by the third quarter of 2012, I'm guessing those are jobs that stayed. So they, each quarter might report more or fewer based on how it was trending. All right, so AAA Fence Incorporated, actually the roofing company did quite well. We'll scroll down while this is thinking here. So the funding categories, one thing that's interesting here is that, so the solid colors are funds awarded, and then the hashed lines are funds received. And here in terms of contracts, there's quite a difference between the $642 million that was awarded and the amount of money received. And I'm not sure, but that would be something to look into. I did hear a few weeks ago that the Department of Transportation realized that it had a large amount of money that it hadn't spent from the stimulus program. And so they were negotiating with the feds how to spend that money. And during this time, I remember at the university, the National Science Foundation opened up a new competition in which scientists who have projects that have perhaps not been funded in the past could submit them, and they would, you know, be available to be evaluated for funding. And similarly, it seems to me that a lot of the stimulus funding was a broad scope of work, and then the details would be figured out between the state and the state agencies and the federal oversight agency.
And the first project in the nation was funded at UAF.
Oh, it was?
Sequoia was the
Yeah.
first
Sequoia.
project in the nation.
Oh, wow.
At UAF.
That's not really shovel-ready.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's,
yes, it was.
It was absolutely
Only for
something.
20,
It was,
25
okay.
years.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, it was.
Yeah.
And it floated last month.
Yeah, but it wasn't designed. I've been thinking about it for 43 years, but it wasn't
Oh, I
designed.
agree.
It wasn't designed.
Okay, well, I'm going to just leave this be, since it doesn't seem to wanna, and I'll try to open a new
I
tab.
wouldn't want a boat that was designed 43 years ago for research. I don't think
Okay.
it would be very up to date.
So,
200 million
It started out with
from
less.
stimulus.
so the next website I'm going to is usaspending.gov, which is an informational website that tells us what the government is spending and in which sectors. And they have, they don't have a lot of information. It's not, it seems to be maybe at a pilot stage, but essentially they have some trends, and then you can look at the Gulf oil spill contracts is its own, you know, segment here, which is pretty interesting. Let's see, earlier, okay, if we look at trends, we can look at, okay, okay. Hmm? Well, it's, what I was trying to get it to do is to focus on Alaska.
But isn't that indicated by the?
Okay, well, no, I have to go scroll. So you have to select a trend, and we're just selecting the default. So here's what I wanted to do. So we'll select Alaska, and recipient state. I'm not sure why. And then we'll look for all of these types of spending. So that's contracts, grants, loans and guarantees, direct payments, insurance, and others. And we will look at the graph. And I think this is Okay, so this shows us the trend across spending categories for federal spending in Alaska, or the spending of federal dollars in Alaska. And we see a real low here in 2007. We have a lot of activity after September the 11th, leading up to 2005. Do any of you know what the military spending was like in that time period? Was there a lot?
It always seems like there's a lot, there are
Yeah,
always buildings and.
But it seems to me that there were specific programs that were post-September the 11th to beef up military presence. But anyway, so by 2007 we're at a low here, and then of course we hit the recession and we start climbing again. So by 2009, we're up to $7.5 trillion, essentially. And if you think about that stimulus plan, if you think about the amount of money spent on that, that's nearly half of this. We could call it a recovery in federal spending for Alaska, but I'm not sure, barring a disaster, that we'd actually be back up here. Well, and we can kind of hope that there's not a need to be back up here. But so now we're on a downward trend at 2012, and with the BRAC program and with other negotiations going on between our congressional delegation and the military and the administration, I might expect that to go down even further, but I haven't looked into the details of proposals for that. But this would be a source to try to understand the trends in particular types of spending if you are in a business that receives federal contracts. Then about the implementation of the Health Act. So Alaska has 128,000 uninsured persons, but a significant amount of the state is covered by some form of government insurance. So this remaining pool are people that are probably poor and they're either not reached by Medicaid, or there are some people who just don't want insurance, and they might have a tough time with the new tax. But there's also people, until the last 4 years or so, graduate students at UAF didn't have health insurance. Now it comes along with any sort of support that you get. So you could have a lot of college students without insurance, for instance. Under the Affordable Care Act, students up to age 26 can still stay on their parents' plan. And so there are a variety of ways, even if Obamacare wasn't implemented in the state, there are a variety of ways in which the state might be able to increase the amount of individuals who have insurance. There is a private insurance market. Those rates tend to be higher than you could get if you worked if your employer bought into a group plan. I know a lot of people are kind of hesitant to buy those private plans because they don't tend to cover a lot and they tend to be high deductible plans. It does protect people against catastrophic loss. Say, you got cancer. We have a colleague who, she said her cancer treatment was $1 million. And until Obamacare was passed, she would have met her cap at the university. And after, there are a variety of policies that allow you to, if you've been covered, seek some other type of coverage under a different plan that would have a different cap. Now under Obamacare, their caps are not allowed for private employers. But the state's high-risk healthcare pool, if you have certain conditions that are considered either risky to you or financially risky for the state, if the state has to pick up the tab for you, those folks can get into this high-risk pool. And Alaska has been one of the states who's really pioneered that configuration of insurance. But those plans tend to cost about between $400 and $500 a month per person. So a lot of people who have serious health problems who would be eligible for that pool probably can't afford that $400. So one thing that Obamacare will do is help subsidize people who, would be eligible for that program but can't pay the bill. Now, Alaska has decided it will not design or implement its own health exchange, so the federal government will be creating more transparency in the market. They're not going to necessarily bring in any new insurers. We might end up with the same pool of insurers that we have now, but the process of buying insurance should be a lot more transparent. And the states who've already designed their healthcare markets, like Massachusetts under former Governor Romney, created a website that you could go to, kind of like, if any of you have used insuremytrip.com or look for car insurance online, you can get quotes from maybe like 6 different insurers. And those would be different plans that you could choose. Right now, if you want to buy an individual plan, in some cases you have to talk to a broker. It's, you can't just sign up with an insurer necessarily. One question outstanding is, what will that exchange look like, and how might Alaskans be able to be involved in the design of that? Because I would imagine that it will be tough to get new insurance companies to want to come to the state unless they can have a large enough pool of people. So that will be something to watch. And in terms of balancing resource extraction and conservation, one sector that I've watched a lot over the past few years has been offshore drilling. And in that, Obama, if you remember right before the Gulf oil spill, he expressed his support for expanded offshore drilling. And after the oil spill, he didn't necessarily back down on that, and so it seems that he still supports offshore drilling, but the other configuration of political actors, including Alaska Native, hunting groups, and environmental groups, are a part of Obama's constituency, so he has to be attentive to their interests. At the same time, the oil companies who have leases, those are legal property rights that they have, that they will most likely be able to exercise. Obama, if he were up, for another re-election, he might have to sweat making a few more deals. But I think we will see a limited offshore drilling program emerge. And as for the Keystone Pipeline, my sense of that program, because the State Department did the environmental impact assessment, a lot of environmentalists were quite critical that the evaluation was not up to EPA standards, and EPA oversees impact assessments across the agencies. So the fact that the State Department conducted the EIA suggests to me that the administration is interested in that pipeline being approved. However, they realize that they have some political troubles in terms of their coalition. One of the issues that came up during the original permitting phase was whether or not Nebraskans supported the pipeline, because it would go through sensitive areas of Nebraska. And apparently, Nebraska, and including the governor, came to some sort of arrangement by which they said, you know, if the pipeline's rerouted, we would support it. It's hard to imagine it not being approved, but it's a pretty big sore spot for environmentalists. So I think that if it is approved, he's going to have to give the environmental community something else. And that would probably, could be expanded investment in alternative energy sources. But that's just kind of an educated guess at this point. In terms of Arctic policy, I think I touched on it a little bit early on, but that's something that the Lieutenant Governor has played a pretty strong role in. And the state is more connected to the international community in that realm than in a lot of other examples. And so you see the state engaging in the Arctic Council, conducting oil spill response drills with Canada, working with Russia in terms of thinking about potential rules around shipping in the Bering Strait. So Arctic policy, it seems, is something that the state is very eagerly engaging in. And the extent to which our state works with the feds, I think, is maybe something to be improved upon. But those are pretty much the thoughts that I wanted to lay out there, in case any of you have any questions.
You mentioned, you know, throwing something else in terms of that, and we're having a discussion with James Fallows the other night, and one of the things that he thought that maybe the latest hurricane in Sandy would actually have a little bit of an impact when you have Christie and Bloomberg actually saying the word climate change. I'm calling it climate disruption now because it sounds a little bit more realistic, I think. Kind of like reform doesn't sound like cut, you know?
Right.
So do you think that sort of thing that could actually have an impact here in a political sense? I mean, obviously we know it's having an effect otherwise.
Right, and I think that the jury's really out on whether disasters tend to reinforce the status quo because people want things to be quickly fixed rather than, you know, mulling what's the best potential remedy we have. So for instance, a lot of the levees built around New Orleans were not built to a much higher standard than they have been previously. So the storm frequency, what I understand, and this was pre-election, so there could be a different story post-election, was that Obama was really following the advice. There's some scholars working on thinking about climate communications and trying to gauge whether Americans would support mitigation or amelioration projects and not necessarily have to call it climate change mitigation. And so what Obama's done is really, you know, try to increase energy efficiency and done these smaller but potentially more widespread changes without categorizing it in a way that might draw more attention to what he's doing. Now, you know, most scholars who study climate change and think about the policy approaches that we'll need to take don't think that those widespread programs are enough. But it's hard, right now it's kind of hard to imagine Obama selling a carbon tax. But if someone like John McCain championed it in the Senate, I think you could see potentially a deal between the parties. But I think Republicans sometimes have an easier time pitching broad environmental policy changes than Democrats do.
Yeah, well, Nixon did pretty well with EPA.
Right, yeah. And
Yeah,
George
reason.
Bush Sr., the Clean Air Act renewal, and so there's you know, George Bush Jr. Created the largest marine protected area in the United States right before he left office. So there is a history there. I don't, you know, I don't think there's going to be a bold climate plan coming out right away. Anybody else? Yeah, Joe?
What do you see as some of the major areas that federal policy will affect Alaska? I mean, you know, we have Pebble Mine potentially, and they're talking a little bit about fracking up here, and you know, like you said, with the insurance company, that could present a problem for the Affordable Care Act if you don't get more insurance companies to come here. I mean, we have a lot of unique issues. We don't pay for a lot of things, and we gain a lot of federal money, and that's decreasing. So it seems like the shrinking of the federal government is going to have a great effect on Alaska one way or another. And I'm just wondering what you thought, see the forecast.
Well, thinking again about the offshore drilling program, I think that reform of the royalties program is likely. There's some states that share in royalties from drilling in federal waters, but Alaska is not one of them right now. We get impact funds that communities that are affected by drilling are able to spend on things like putting a rec center in their community or, you know, infrastructure, but they can't spend it, they haven't been able to spend it for, you know, whatever they want. So if we did start sharing royalties, that could be an area to offset, you know, some declining revenues from the oil sector. And no one seems to be able to predict what's up with the gas pipelines in the state. So I don't think I would even really hazard a guess on that one. In the works, I guess that's kind of the perennial statement on the gas lines. Great, well, thank you very much.